Welcome to HRUnpacked, a podcast about HR workplace issues, where we analyse and then discuss the latest developments in HR and employment law that impact both employers and employees. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Jonathan. Welcome to this podcast where we will be discussing the healing process, which was established to support current and former NHS Highland employees affected by bullying. Based on the healing principles agreed upon by NHS Highland executives, trade unions and whistleblowers, the healing process provided a non-adversarial avenue for addressing concerns, prioritising personal recovery over blame. And today we welcome Tracy Boylin and Rebecca Foreman, who have been heavily involved in the foundation and running of the healing process. So welcome, Tracy, and welcome, Rebecca. Really good to have you here in Salford with us today. Pleasure to have you. So it'd be good for you to introduce yourselves first, explain your background, and then we can get into some more details around the healing process and what it is all about.
Lovely, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you.
I'm Tracy Boylin. I former HR director.
Yep.
Worked for 30 years, mainly in the public sector, education, charity, NHS, but now run my own company, People Genetics, which is primarily about helping organisations to change their culture when it's gone wrong.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Foreman and I work with CMP Resolutions. We were a organisation working with NHS Highland at the start of this, so very much supporting the organisation and getting the scheme up and running, and then administering it and supporting the participants in the healing process right until the very end, and organising the panel and doing all of that. So
great stuff. And we were just talking before about how long this has been going on. You said quite a long time.
Yeah, so when they approached us, for me, they were saying possibly a 6-month contract, which turned into 3 years worth of work.
Well, that's always good, isn't it? Brilliant. Well, it'd be good to start off with what it's all about, you know, how it started, the context, because I'm very much removed from this. I know you've been involved, Jonathan.
Yeah, we're
but
out with the research side of it,
I'm completely new to this, so it'd be good to get the whole view of where it kicked off and started.
Do you want me to kick up? So I'd been working with the Scottish Government, first of all, helping to set up what is the equivalent of the National Guardian here.
Right.
So in Scotland, they call it the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer. And while I was doing that, the Sturrock inquiry into NHS Highland was running. So that was after 4 whistleblowers had come forward. Had a long journey trying to expose the bullying culture that was in Highland and not getting anywhere. So eventually went to the press. And as a result, the Scottish Government commissioned John Sturrock QC to lead the inquiry. And alongside that, I was in the process of helping the Scottish Government to set up the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer with standards. They very much, interestingly, wanted me to keep the different stakeholders separate because they said there'll be blood if you get them all in the same room.
Right.
And I said, no, they won't. Not when I facilitate, because I don't allow that. We manage it properly, because that's what leadership for me is about. And how do you get agreement if you don't have people in the same room? So that went really well, and they was amazed. Sturrock completed his inquiry and submitted the report. It was damning.
Right.
So one of the things he said, which I was pleased when I was reading it, because a lot of the reports that happen say they will be learning, but then nothing happens. So it's like Groundhog Day. But then he said there's got to be a process that resolves this. Hence, the healing process was then looked into. What became the healing process was how that evolved.
yeah, he recommended that there needed to be some form of healing that needed to happen for quite a large number of victims of people that came forward. He spoke to about 200 people or something, didn't he? In the Sturrock review, So it was quite an extensive inquiry,
Okay. And you were involved, weren't you, Jonathan?
Yes, so we've just evaluated, haven't we? The participants who went through the healing process, about 274, something like that. We were able to contact the majority of them and ask them to evaluate what they thought about it. And to tell us what they thought about, or how they felt going through the process, and whether it's beneficial or not, or effective. And in the main, overall, the majority said it was effective. But we can kind of come on to that a little bit. In terms of the healing process and the principles behind it, what was the thinking behind the actual principles? So what are the principles and what was the thinking behind it, which guided the healing process?
Well, it was, I mean, one of the key things, so CMP came into the process as it was being created. So one of the key principles really was, similar to what Tracy's talked about already, was that co-production. The idea that it really needed to include the views of the victims, and that was absolutely central to the way in which it was put together. So there was a series of meetings and not interviews, but like focus groups, I suppose, or group works or facilitated sessions where there was a representative of the executive, but they were meeting with whistleblower groups, stakeholder groups, the legal team that was supporting it in terms of the development of the frameworks, trade unions. So that was very much a kind of core component of it, to say, well, what would a scheme look like if you were going to, what are the sort of key tenets of that sort of scheme. And then anonymity was really important. So the need to remain anonymous. And there was a real fear of victimisation and retribution from NHS Highland, given what had come out of the Sturrock review. So anonymity was a key principle.
And no blame was a big part of, had to be a big part of it. And I think all stakeholders struggled with that. Because in most, you take a grievance process, someone has to be right, someone has to be wrong.
Substantiated, unsubstantiated.
And that, for me, is fundamentally wrong as a HR professional, which many HR professionals may shudder at when I say that. But that doesn't bring people together and allow them to move on, because someone then feels, well, I've been blamed, or if they feel that the outcome wasn't right. So it had to be no blame. And so when we again got into the detail, we looked at what happens in criminal proceedings with restorative justice. And we started to take a lot of the fundamentals of restorative justice to bring into how we would approach it, really.
The no blame was very powerful. So the people who when the scheme was set up, I think, and people started to engage with it, they found that incredibly powerful, that they wouldn't have to come and prove their case, that they would be believed, and that you had people who, had decades of lever arch files and documents in their attic that they would bring to a meeting, and they would, were told, you don't need any of that. We believe you. You don't have to justify how you're feeling or why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. You can just focus on that restoration, about trying to move past it and to get some sort of closure. And people, I think, found that one of the most powerful aspects of it.
What was the dynamic like in the room? I'm really, because
interesting.
That sounds amazing, to not have to come and prove your case as such. But that's so unfamiliar, as you said, to kind of legal people.
And there was a lawyer on the panel. There was a lawyer on the panel, and he would admit, probably, if he was sat in Neil, he found it the hardest. He really found it. But at the end of it, he says, oh my gosh, it's opened the way that I now think about how we should approach law, which for me is amazing. So at first, there was a lack of trust because they'd been harmed by the procedures. Two of us, they wanted to know who the panel would be, so we openly shared our backgrounds, and it was like, there's two HR directors. We all know, HR's got a bad rep. It's not great. You've got a lawyer. So at first the take-up was very minimal. And, it was watching them as we built that trust. So that people say it takes a long time to build trust. We built it in a 2-hour meeting.
Right.
And some of the comments that came back to share with us as a panel, why that happened.
How did you do that?
So if I share some of the comments, probably I would articulate it better. And we was just getting this as feedback, unsolicited. So Dame Michael, Tracy, Francis, Neil and Ian, from the outset, the session could not have been managed any better. I liked the format. Very importantly to me, you had read and understood my material and then listened carefully and empathetically. Beyond that, your words of affirmation and description of legacy were utterly invaluable to me. I cannot describe my reaction to hearing such things from people who have fully understood the journey which I have undertaken. Over the last few days, an enormous burden has fell from my shoulders, and my wife says I look busier, happier and younger.
Right.
So it was how we interacted with them, that they didn't feel judged, that we'd read it. And so whatever they submitted, we had spent that time reading it in detail. We checked what our perception and understanding was. Is that, this is how I've read that and interpreted that. Is that how we should have understood it? Is that what you meant by that? And people had said they'd never had that. They'd never had that dialogue in terms of that understanding and listening before, really. So for me, that was so powerful to be sat there and feeling the work then was so valid that you were doing.
Yeah, been very proud.
Yeah, very proud.
There was a whole, there was a whole kind of scheme that sort of fitted around the panel as well. So people would register for the healing process,
right?
And they would have an individual session with a CMP practitioner.
Yeah. And
so for a lot of people who might not have talked about their experiences before, they might not have been through any kind of grievance procedure. They might, some of them, the scheme was open to ex-employees as well.
Okay.
So it was both current and ex-employees before a certain date. So it went back quite a few years as well, which was one of the recommendations as well from Stirrup. So part of that process was about was spending some time with a CMP practitioner who did some of that, exactly as Tracy said, the really intense listening, helping people some of whom had been through incredibly traumatic experiences, formulate a narrative, because and to structure what they were, and then to understand, I suppose, the healing process, what it was, what they could access. So you could access and go to the panel and present your case. Sounds a bit formal. I don't think it's quite as formal as that. But you could also be instantly referred for therapeutic services.
Okay,
you didn't have to go to the panel to get therapeutics. We can make that referral on your behalf. Direct. They were one of the stakeholders in the process. Was Validium, which is an EAP provider.
Yeah.
You could also get a written apology, from a personalised written apology. Again, you didn't have to go to the panel. You could get all of this if you went to the panel, but you could also get it if you didn't want to as well. So there were all these different options for people. So people would often spend an hour or 2 hours with a CMP practitioner, just understanding the process, talking through their experiences, getting their thoughts together. And one of the things that was really good was they could come back as many times as they wanted to that session, to help them prepare for the panel or to prepare for whatever outcome they wanted. Some people just did that. They didn't go on to next stages. They just came to those early sessions, and then decided that was enough for them. Some people just had counselling or psychotherapeutic interventions, and then you said 270 odd did decide to go through to the panel. Okay. I think what's interesting about the healing process is what was agreed was that there was a financial aspect to it.
Right.
Which I think was quite innovative and very different from other sort of similar types of schemes, was the financial, not the financial award that you could get. And that wasn't done like a employment tribunal. It was based on the harm that was done to you. So the focus of the healing process was about recognising, acknowledging and restoring harm that was done.
Okay.
So which is why the non-adversarial kind of aspect worked really well, because you would go to the panel, you would talk about your experience, what that had done to you, what it had done to your family, and for years, for some people decades, and the panel could make a financial award if that's what you asked for.
So they decided that, did they, based on their view of what had been relayed to them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So which is why we were saying just before, there was a lot of, the panel went through a lot of training. They worked together before the scheme was launched, just to try out different case studies to benchmark, to make sure you were making,
because we would have people, it's perceptive, there is a perception in how we approach this, so we would all have different perspectives. So we took some case studies and said, okay, let's look at how we'd all approach this, and the first one we did with the trial first one was really difficult. Because we all had such varying views. But as time went on and we went through that training and we all shared why we were coming at it from where we were coming at it, we just gelled. We literally, we still meet up now as a panel.
Did you spend a lot of time together then?
We spent a hell of a lot of time together.
Every Tuesday and Thursday for weeks and weeks and weeks.
So a hell of a lot of time together. Yeah. And, we have become all of, the five of us now meet up for lunches, evening meals. We have gelled so much as part of that process.
Yeah, I bet you have.
So much
it's quite an emotional journey, I imagine.
Yeah. And it was intense. Hearing the harm that had been done was hard every Tuesday and Thursday all day long, having to do that, but also looking after each other as well was part of it. But I think that support, because when you think about HR processes, we fling employees into this. There is a grievance, there is a disciplinary, and where is that support? And what most employers will say, well, they've got a trade union. Some are not in trade unions, but the trade union don't give that level of support that the CMP did. And I think helping and guiding. And if we're saying our policy should be humanised, shouldn't that be a big part of it for me, really? So I think, literally every part of the process had an element. People might have not realised that they'd been through it and might not be able to articulate it in that way. But we saw the fact that they came to it and they'd had that guidance and they'd had that support. They were able to articulate it much better than an employee coming in on their own and thinking, I'm sat in front of 5 people here, oh my gosh, this is scary. I feel traumatised, I'm suffering from PTSD, and they're on their own. So it was lovely to have that, really.
I think you're right. I think it's all of those components, isn't it? The fact that you would sign up for a process, you're not really sure, but it was how you were treated right from the outset in terms of, how people spoke to you, the fact that you were believed. Then you would have a session with your CMP associate and you could have as many of those as you wanted. And that was really to help you formulate what you wanted to say. And I think there was this enormous sense of relief for people when they would come to those sessions and then to prepare them to go to the panel. Which sometimes, because of the volume of people that signed up to the scheme, it did take a lot longer. You said you thought it was going to be 6 months. It ended up being 3 years. And along the way we had discussions about things. Should we have extra panels? So could we bring another group of individuals together? But all of that work that the panel had done around working together around standardisation, it was felt that bringing in a new panel, you'd have to work doubly hard to make sure that there was, it was equitable between panels. Because there was that financial element to it. So the financial oversight and the governance was really important about what was happening with that.
So was that money paid from the trust?
So it was paid, came out of, went through the remuneration committee, get my words out. But again, the lack of trust. So sometimes people said, well, hang on, I'll have gone through this panel. I don't want NHS Highland to know that was me, but they write the cheque.
Right, okay.
So suddenly it's not anonymous. So with that, again, and I think that was great that we devised the panel and that was the process identified, but then it's how we responded to that feedback. So where they said is consultation and people don't believe there's real consultation because organisations have already decided what they're doing, we've actually, that's a really good point. That would highlight who they are. So Shepherd and Webberburn, was it? The lawyer from Neil, who was on the panel, that was the law firm he worked for, and he went back to his firm and said, could we write the cheque and then invoice?
Oh, okay. So it kept that distance.
So it did kept. So there was that privacy that happened as a result, really. So where people wanted, some people were happy for the trust to write the cheque, others said, no, I want to retain, I feel there would be retribution and I don't want them to know who I am. So...
But the money came from a separate pot supplied by Scottish Government. It didn't come out of NHS Highland's
There was a PET.
budget. Scottish Government funded the money to pay the financial awards through the healing process, and to pay for to set up and manage the scheme as well. And for the therapeutic counselling. So you could get a standard 6 sessions, and then you could have additional support as was kind of determined by the company.
Yeah, that's a massive part of it, isn't it? That support side.
It is, yeah. Just to summarise it, because it took me about a year to understand how it works.
It's quite complicated.
When we started working on it, with the research, we thought this is such an unusual way of dealing with it, and a great way, but unusual. So in terms of the timeline then, so there were issues within NHS Highland around bullying and all manner of things and whistleblowing. John Stewart did the review, he produced the report. Out of the report came the healing process. And then 340 registrants registered for it. 272 actually went to a panel hearing. Then the panel, we summarised them in 5 outcomes.
Yeah, they were,
So what were the 5 outcomes? Can you remember?
So the 5 outcomes which the participant could ask for were, 1 was the apology. And that would be written directly by the chief exec of Highland. The second one was, and as Rebecca has said, they could still access some of this without coming to the panel, but some of them wanted to come and have the panel hear it.
Could you choose all 5 outcomes?
You could, It wasn't just what, you could have 1 and that was it. The second one was the therapies, the support, where that was fast track for them.
Psychological therapies.
The third one was you could be re-engaged if you'd been dismissed, asked to be re-engaged, or redeployed if you were still there and you felt your department was particularly toxic. So we could make that recommendation. The fifth one was the financial element. The fourth one, was the financial element. And then the fifth one, we committed to hear what they felt the learning should be from the organisation. And we turned that into a quarterly report of themes we submitted then to the organisation to say, to make sure there's not a healing process too. These are the things you've got to address in the organisation that are still ongoing.
Reinvestment and improvement.
Well, as is quite common in these situations, what a lot of people want is for it never to happen again. You know, I've been through this really awful, terrible, traumatic experience that, you know, and I want this to not happen to anybody else that works there. And so that organisational learning piece was absolutely essential. And it was really interesting to try and do that anonymously to maintain the confidentiality of the participants. And so it was envisaged that this, what the panel had is this fantastic overview, and they could summarise all of that with thematic elements, and that went back to NHS Highland on a quarterly basis and was fed into the board. It was a standing agenda item on the board, and they did have for a time a healing process champion on the board as well. Again, and I think your last report was in 22?
Yes, it was 22, that was submitted.
What was the reaction from managers and from the senior leadership within the trust? Because if you've got a no-blame approach, you know, we all know this in HR, if you're saying to staff, if you come along to this process, we will believe you no matter what. What was the managers' reactions to it? So
the two sort of downsides, I would say, to it, that I think if we're looking at a similar process that might help other organisations, were, for me, you got managers who said, hang on, so if that person's coming to complain about me and you're believing them, are you fundamentally saying I'm guilty, if you like? So managers were impacted by that themselves. They could still come to the healing process though, and present their own case, and they felt very strong. And I said, but hang on, there'll be nothing on your file, so there's no outcome that says, and nothing recorded anywhere, and what we're listening to is how they felt and how it impacted, not an action that was done or whatever. But I think people felt
it wasn't supposed to supersede the grievance process. I think you need to be really clear. So if you came to and you went to speak to the panel and you said, you know, I believe my manager has bullied me and this is my experience, the panel weren't saying, okay, your manager has bullied you. They were saying, we believe you have felt this experience and in certain circumstances, they might recommend that a grievance is then made, but they wouldn't be determining that person had or had not done those actions. It was it was very individual. It was very about your experience, your perception, and your individual journey. But also it had to align to, you've got natural justice. You can't just go in and say, well, this person did this to me and that's the truth. You need to align with natural justice. People need to be able to state their case and their side of things. So the idea was that it would complement those types of processes that are back in the organisation. It wasn't designed to supersede.
If you ever hear a grievance, you hear one version of events, you hear another, and you generally fall
which is a
somewhere
true
in
one.
between, don't you? You know?
I remember listening to we take the students to the tribunal to watch the case, and we watched one case, and the employee said that the employer said that the employee threw a mobile phone at another employee because they had an argument. So the employer was on the witness stand saying, he threw the mobile phone at this employee, so he was disciplined. And then when the employee came, or the ex-employee came up on the stand, he said, I passed in the mobile phone and it dropped out of my hand because he didn't pick it up properly. So the judge had to decide who was telling the truth. And he believed the employee because the employer said that the phone had smashed.
Right.
So, there's that different perceptions, isn't there, around what happens in the workplace. And that's one of the great things about this is that people have the confidence to say, we believe what you're saying and how you feel about it, most importantly, because people do react differently.
Well, it goes back to the adversarial approach. Actually, if you're positional and you're there to win, which is essentially what a grievance process does, then somebody is always a loser. So you're, that within that process. Whereas I think what the healing process was designed to do was to say, in order to heal and move forward, you need to feel that there's some sort of closure, and that part of that is about being really listened to, and your experience is your experience. Yes, there is a place to have a judgment as to whether that has been found or not found, but actually that doesn't negate your experience, which we know from grievance procedures anyway, employment tribunals, how the emotion of it is not dealt with. The practical facts, but the emotion is still there. So,
I mean, research says 20% when we get impacted is about what happened to us. 80% is how we react to it.
The emotion.
So we focused on that 80%, if you like, about how they were feeling, how it had impacted, how they were reacting to it, what had happened as a result.
Participants did struggle a little bit with knowing that, because it was anonymous, obviously you didn't know who had also signed up to the scheme. But there, it was possible that, because people are both perpetrators and also victims at the same time, so it was possible that you would be a victim of bullying, and also your bully would also be signed up to the scheme and potentially could also have had a financial award. So that was very difficult for some people to kind of get their head round, really.
Did you find that, without obviously spilling details about it, did you find that there were people that were bullied and accused of bullying as well?
Yes, we had definitely, and it was really weird because depending on the timing, it was very clear. You sort of read the documents, and then when you realised that we'd had maybe the participant first who would claimed they'd been bullied, and what had happened as a result. And then we actually would find, a couple of months later, we were hearing the other side from the person who they'd said was the perpetrator. So that was fascinating. Would that have probably sometimes changed how we'd reacted? Maybe, because we are human and we hear what we hear. But so you had managers who were saying, I'm being accused and I don't get my say, who were struggling with that. And you had people who felt they were the victim, who were saying, but you're also going to award them potentially. And then what are you doing going forward? How's this being? So that bit, that for me is the organisational development, what needs to happen in the organisation. But participants were struggling with that because they're saying, could I still go into my department and that bully still be there?
So a lot of them were still working together,
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So that we still had that. So that was fascinating, really. So
that is, How did you decide on, I know you touched on it earlier, but the level of financial recompense, for want of a better phrase, when it was all about subjectivity.
Yeah, so
that feels quite tough.
It was tough and really, really hard. So you had 2 HR directors, myself being a former one.
Yeah.
We did have a clinical professional. So we had one of the panel members, Frances, was an ex-medical director. So she could assess from a clinical perspective the harm they were talking about and what they were relaying. We had the lawyer. And then we had Michael, who was the chair, who'd been headed up in Unite, been quite senior in Unite, heading up the trade unions, really. So really different perspectives. So we took into account what had happened, how long it had been going on.
Right.
Impact.
Was like a table, like in the tribunal we have injury to feelings? We
literally did base it on. And it was weird because very quickly from that, the case studies where we were at very different perspectives, as we went into it, we were all on the same page.
Right.
So we were all coming up with where we would fit them in the different brackets. So there were 5 brackets. So it might be interesting for people listening to understand that. So the first bracket was for, we could say we were awarding nothing.
Okay.
And it was, so bracket 1 was 0 to 5k.
Yeah.
Then it went from 5k, I can't remember exactly, but the maximum bracket was 100k.
Really? Wow.
And we was given dispensation to say if it exceeded that, if we felt something exceeded that, we could go beyond that and ask for an award to be made over and above 100k. And in tribunal, those awards are very, very rarely given. So we did award some people in that top bracket.
You've got the figures, haven't you?
Yeah, I have, yeah. So 81% of payments were below 15,000.
Yeah.
So, because I know when we did the research on it, we thought, well, compensation would be quite prominent, but it wasn't. The apology was the big thing. People just wanted an apology, really.
Right.
And then the people that did receive some kind of money compensation, or however you want to label it. They all said it wasn't that important to them, really. It was more about the apology.
Yeah.
But 81% was below 15,000, although there were 2 individual settlements between 60,000 and 95,000.
I was going to say, did this, if someone that was awarded, say, the 60, did they have to sign some kind of equivalent settlement agreement and then it doesn't progress to tribunal? Or was there potential that it goes to tribunal as well, keeping it very separate?
What they had to agree to and what we did take into account. So some may have already actually been awarded money in tribunal. So that had to be taken into account.
Yeah.
So we couldn't pay twice, if you like, because it was public funds. And secondly, that if they hadn't been to tribunal and it was a process that was in the system, or they'd got to tribunal after, we would share what they'd been awarded for the tribunal to consider.
Okay.
So
and that was part of the financial governance part of it, that you wouldn't be double paying, that you wouldn't, that was part of the fairness aspect. You couldn't go to this process and have a financial award recognising the harm and then go to an employment tribunal and get a more formal compensation.
But just to emphasise the point you made, Jonathan, there was a case where we wanted to award payment and the person said, no, it's not about that. Please do not. I do not. I will not accept it. So we took on board that they didn't want the money. They wanted the apology. They wanted to be heard. And they said, we're being heard here now. And they wanted the organisational learning to come as part of it.
Like you say, that's a lot about closure, isn't it?
Yeah.
The average award was just over 10,000, but the total was 2.8 million.
Yeah.
That's some investment.
Yes.
Because I say it's an investment, not a cost.
Yeah, it is
the
an
Scottish
investment.
Government.
Yeah, definitely, because it allowed people to move on and live their lives and function again in work where they hadn't been functioning. So a lot of people had been off sick on long term. We did get some costs because one of the ministers, Jean Freeman, who's since sort of retired, was sharing some information because we're going, they could award what? Really? Is that what we're going to do? But we all know what legal fees cost, and we see how they escalate really, really quickly.
Average 350 quid an hour for a lawyer these days.
Exactly. So when she looked at the previous years, compared to the overall cost of what they'd invested, because I do believe it's an investment, that was a third cheaper than what the legal fees had been spent the previous year.
Okay.
So,
and have we looked at return on investment? So in the same kind of organisation, have they had a reduction in sickness, a reduction in attrition, a reduction in litigation? Do we know whether that kind of feed that loop back in as...
So that's part of what was being recommended, that those things were looked at to see if it was impacting as part of the learning. Because our role sees and we've stepped back, I don't know if they physically are doing that.
Understood.
I think the organisational development, there was an issue around, have we got capacity in the organisation to deliver some of this, what's needed? And that is always a pressure in the NHS. I know what it's like as a HR director in the NHS. There's never enough hours in the day.
And you know, this day and age, national insurance increases. And
absolutely. Your day is cut, and what you think you might get done in a day, you know, other things come up happening, especially in the size of trust that Highland was. So they wanted some further investment, and Scottish Government said, no, we've invested all of this now. You as a health board have to stand on your own feet and do the investment that's needed. So I don't think they've took up any external help. But they were committed as a board to try and do that, but we've not been involved. Well, I've personally not been involved. I don't know if you have.
No, we haven't. And I think, you know, there is a question, I think, about as to how, yes, the scheme was fantastic and it supported and helped hundreds of people who had been really badly treated. And, you know, you mentioned some of the stories, you know, really quite dreadful, and they committed to the organisational learning, but you know, we haven't had much of insight as to what the longevity of that it has been and what changes. I mean, Highland still has the same issues about recruiting a very large rural area, how you recruit and retain staff, and how you manage disciplinary code of conduct issues, for example, when you only have one consultant and you can't manage without that individual. So there's lots of pressures, particularly for them as an organisation. So,
but when we reviewed the healing process, so we spoke to 52 out of the 272 participants. 93% of those that we spoke to said it was very fair or a fair process that they went through. So the feedback is very positive about it. There were some things. Some of the comments were around it kind of brought up things that they might have wanted to have forgotten. So the process actually brought things back, but they understood that they had to go through that then to try and get some kind of closure, or to try and get something that was, to try and deal with something that they were still dealing with. But obviously the majority said it was a very, very effective process, and they were happy that they went through it.
Right. Okay.
And I think that was really interesting about the evaluation, because you looked at the structures of justice, different types of justice, and applied that. And that was very much one of the principles that it needed to really feel like you are restoring and, you know, and repairing damage that had been done over a number of years. And there was a number of ex-employees as well that there were people that were current employees. Quite a large proportion of those that signed up to the scheme were previous.
Did you get many ex-employees going back?
Yes.
You know, did you say one of the options was re-engagement?
Yeah. Well, a lot said. So I don't think a lot went back. Some said, please don't ask to re-engage me, but others felt they could move on to other things, and it had allowed them to, although it triggered it, as Jonathan said, there've been those triggers in reliving it, as there always is whenever it affects you, you know, from a well-being mental health perspective. They finally felt they could let it go and move on, because they'd been heard, and for them they'd had some form of justice in being heard, and something happening as a result and a way forward.
Right.
So one of the approaches that we were really keen to ensure was a trauma-informed approach to the initial one-to-one sessions, for example. So if people, so they didn't have to retell their story, so that you would talk to your CMP person, they would help you formulate a narrative. They could write that up for you on your behalf if you wanted, and then that narrative could go. So that would form part of your referral, for example, for therapeutic counselling. So it would minomise the amount of time for exactly that reason, because there were people who said, well, I've told my story in an investigation, I've told my story, I've whistleblown, I've been to ET, you know, I am and each time I do it, I'm reliving it. So we tried to create a system that minimised that and tried to mitigate some of that damage. So
some of the participants were still very raw though about what they've been through. When we interviewed them, it was harrowing.
Yeah,
listen to what they were saying and how they felt about what they've been through as well. And it kind of brings home how important it is to treat people kindly
with respect
and
as
respect
well.
in the workplace. Even if you disagree with maybe how they're feeling or what they've done, you still have to deal with it in the right way.
Yeah, I know you say about no blame, etc. But when you use the word harrowing there, was some action taken against the perpetrators, if that's the right word, when it's not a blame game?
So sometimes we said that there should be, one of the recommendations we made is there should be a procedure here that looks at that from a natural justice point of view, because that's not what we're here for as a panel. So we did highlight where we felt they should. Yeah. Whether Highland did or didn't, we didn't. Right,
that was part of the recommendations. Understood.
But it was harrowing. But again, they set the criteria. So one of the criteria, for example, was you had to have been an employee or ex-employee to actually get before the panel, and you didn't get before the panel if you hadn't. And then partway through, we had a case because of the number that came through and, delays in that we could only do so many in each week, where one of the individuals had died by suicide.
Oh, dear me.
So the husband and the sister said, we want to come before the panel and have her voice heard. Yeah. And everyone's going, that's not the natural reaction, but that's not the criteria, that's not the criteria. And I'm like, but this is, we deliberately, when we were drafting it all, said this should be guidance because it's not been done before. Yeah. Not set in stone in terms of its procedure, policy, etc. So I get that. Now we had a real big debate on the panel about whether we should hear them or not, because what state of mind would these people be in when they lost, a very close person to them. But I felt strongly from the lived experience that we should, because I know how it impacts on the wider family. They see this person that they love having endured that trauma and living with that trauma. So we pushed and they accepted. They'd relax the criteria for allowing. So that was the most harrowing panel we did that day. It was awful. But again, seeing the closure for that family, for me, was a moment that I'll never forget. And if I died tomorrow, I'd be proud of that. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It should be, absolutely.
So for me, that was key.
42% of the participants, so 272, 42% were ex-employees who went through it, which just shows you people do want justice.
Yeah.
Which is also why it took a longer time for people, because there was quite a lot of energy put into advertising it. There was social media. We had a social media support organisation. There was a completely separate website. So all of those things were in place. CMP managed all of the comms, so it's completely separate from NHS Highland. So there was that real divide. So people, because of that fear of victimisation, and quite a number of people were ex-employees.
People are quite wary, aren't they, sometimes about things like that?
Yeah. Which is why the stakeholder groups were very good, because there were some victim groups that had got together. They were quite vocal, which is why engaging with them in the co-production process was so important, because they helped to spread the word and to, I guess, to evidence the anonymity aspect of the scheme, the independence of the scheme. Yeah.
You said something at the start about getting people, I can't remember your exact words, so forgive me, but about the power of getting people in a room together and talking it out. And I know at Peninsula, we're doing a lot more mediation than we've ever done before, because it's just so powerful. It is. Yeah. And, people... No one really wants to go to tribunal, do they? Yeah. So if you can get two parties in a room and mediate and resolve it in a really humanised, to your point, and choice of word, in a humanised and respectful way, how brilliant is that?
It's really powerful. I mean, a long time ago, for me, the fundamental sort of ethos of all my work was when I worked at a further education college, and I left. I'd left that when I started my family, and then I got a call because I'd seen it in the news, but they dismissed removed the whole senior management team. Okay. And that the staff went out on strike, and it became the longest running strike in education history. And I got a call from the guy they brought in to do a turnaround. And it was 3 million in the red, which was, it's a lot of money now, but still a lot of money back then. And he said, I need you back. And I said, why do you need me? My daughters were 1 and 2. I'm thinking, gee, crikey, do I want to take this on? And he's like, please come back. And I'm like, why? You don't even know me. And he said, it's the first time, Tracy, I've ever gone outside and talked to the trade unions who were all on strike and the staff. And he said they wouldn't trust me. And he said, I said to him, well, who would you trust? Right. And they went, there was a woman here who was a former HR person, not the HR director, but we'd trust her. Right. And he said, I have never heard trade unions rate an HR person in my life. So he said, please just come back. So I did. I went back, meant to be on a short-term contract just to help with the recovery plan. And Ofsted came in because we thought it was challenging, because part of the recovery plan and their conditions were we had to pay $1 million back a year and break even. And I'm like, wow, that's going to be challenging. Yeah. But we cleared the deficit in 18 months. Wow. So they asked how we'd done that, because they were coming in every quarter to check our progress. And I said, I haven't done any evaluation yet. I've just been focusing on trying to restore trust, work forward. And so they set up some focus groups and went and spoke to staff. And they said, basically, she made no decisions about us without us. Right. And he said that theme kept coming through, and it was that way I got them all in the room. And we didn't always agree, but they understood why we'd set on a way forward. And they'd all had their voice heard, really. Yeah. And that was critical in getting that college turned around. And it won't be turned around now. It'd have been closed had we not turned it around.
I bet you weren't on a short-term contract then.
So I ended up becoming the HR director. And for me, that engagement and that discussion. And I think people are thinking, well, are we going, I get when I go in and do the culture change with organisations, are you not going to raise expectations that we can't meet here? And I said, no, because I'm always very honest. And we have to have those honest discussions about what the realities are if we can't get to this. So what is the best way forward? But if they don't input to it, they're not going to own it. Yeah. So for me, that is fundamental, really.
Well, it's the same components as in mediation, which is being really listened to. And I think that was the core kind of tenet of the healing process, same as in mediation, is that, and it speaks to that emotional element of a dispute, that emotional element where you as a human being feel hurt and damaged. And if you feel that someone is really genuinely listening to you with deep active listening, there is a lot of kind of recognition being seen, that sort of closure that you can get.
So right, powerful. I always say to my team, and if we're doing hearings, etc., with clients, if the individual at the end of it stands up and shakes your hand and there's mutual respect, albeit you've totally disagreed in the room, but you've treated them fairly in a human way, you've done your job well. There's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah. And the way we looked at this evaluation was through that lens of theory. Academics love a bit of a theory. So
Give us a theory, Jonathan.
Give me a theory. So it was a theory of justice. So you look at it from the outcome, which is distributive justice, from the process and interaction. So those 3 elements we looked at, how were the participants dealt with through the healing process, how they felt about the outcome, and how they felt about the process. And across all 3 elements, they were all very positive about what they went through, even the outcome. Even when they said they got an apology and they were happy with the apology, but it was an apology from the organisation and some wanted it from the individual. Yeah. Now, that's probably never going to happen, because the individual will never probably apologise. So that's maybe where there's bits missing, but they've got the apology from the organisation, which offers some kind of closure. Yeah. But the healing process has its roots in NHS Highland, doesn't it? That's where it kind of stems from. Yeah. But I know you've kind of branched out and it's looking at other ways of disseminating this type of thing, not necessarily the healing process, but can you talk about how it's been kind of disseminated out into other organisations or other sectors?
So in my work, I just automatically bring those elements to it when I'm looking at culture change and they said it's broken down or toxic. So not per se, just because for me, and you do get, I remember one organisation I went into and the HR director was sat there looking at her. So she went, when I got your bio, it said you was a former HR director. And she went, I'm not understanding where you're coming at this from. And I said, from HR perspective. And she went, really? So she went, so whose side do you sit on, management or staff? And I went, whose side do I sit on? I said, wow. And I said, that for me is where fundamentally why HR gets that bad rep, because this is not Russia v Ukraine, is it? And when you take sides in an organisation, you're setting yourself up to fail, And so she said, so how do you see HR? And I said, as a conscience of the organisation, people genetics, for me, because people say, I thought you was a science organisation when I saw the name. And I said, it's about your DNA of your people. That's the genetic bit for me. So I automatically do this per se as part of my work, but as yet, on a wider scale, there's a lot of interest from the regulators about this. There's a lot of interest from individual trusts about this who know they've got issues. But I think what's going to help with the white paper is, well, how did it benefit? Because there is a big investment. They know what it costs, obviously. It's out there, 2.8 million, as Jonathan said. So is it going to give us that return on investment? And that's the wariness of it being taken up on a wider scale, But
it's designed to address the institutional problems, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So, the investment of what the government have put into it, not just in terms of the money side of it, but the time and the importance they put towards it. It's a long-term nature of what they're trying to do, is to trying to stop things happening in the short, medium and long term as well.
Hardly a week goes by when there isn't an expose. You're talking the football, cricket, gymnastics, the Red Arrows, the Met Police, how many organisations have had an inquiry, a review, you had the National Lottery, all of the, really large exposés on this. You mentioned the word toxic. I don't like the word toxic, but, really difficult, challenging cultures where people have been horrifically treated. And so there is, the Football Association has done something similar. Right. We know what's going on in terms of cricket and in terms of gymnastics. So there's a lot of relevance of the learning from the healing process to other sectors that have been, I guess, outed in terms of their cultures and the way that they've treated their people, whether that be sports people, not necessarily employees, but maybe where there's a different dynamics, again, about the power and dynamics in particular relationships. So there's a lot of learning, I think.
And if you want to look at it from a purely cost perspective, as a lot of CEOs do, because in this economic climate, that tends to be the first focus. Most inquiries are QC-led. So the average inquiry costs 10 million. So compared to 2.8 million to an inquiry, and if you can intervene with some of these principles before that, and some of the principles you could do then maybe without that cost element being done, because you're intervening much earlier, the harm is not as great. So for me, I think there's definitely a massive cost benefit to doing some of this.
As well, what I've observed from the types of queries we're getting from businesses now, there's such a pressure pot out there at the minute. There's quite a lot of conflicts in work. Because there's so many pressures from an economic, social, political aspects that it does bring that feeling of tension into the workplace. So when we're getting grievances off clients now, they're never straightforward.
No.
They're always humdingers that you have to really unravel and very complex and go to the root of the organisation. So I do think right now in the world we're in, it's definitely got a place.
We're doing some research into WhatsApp messages at the moment. Because there's been high-profile tribunal cases. So we're looking at the moment how many tribunal cases have looked at WhatsApp messages as evidence, because that's becoming more prominent in terms of evidence, but it's affecting people outside of the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where people are included on WhatsApp messages because it's part of the job and they need to be informed about things. But then things get said, and then that's causing them certain feelings because they have to be part of the group to find out about things, but they don't want to be involved in the kind of banter side of it as well. So there's a fine line between what goes on with things like that.
Well, essentially what you're doing is looking at the power dynamics almost in a WhatsApp group. You can't leave because you need to be involved, and it says something about your work, but you also don't want to be there. It's interesting.
You just sorted our theoretical framework.
There
now.
we go.
Thanks very much for that.
We've had a debate. I was with some friends from who I went to uni with this weekend, and we met up and we were talking about social media. Every one of us wants to come off it.
Yeah.
But none of us will.
That haven't yet.
Because the mums groups and all these things that you'll miss out on.
Yeah, it's a fear of missing out and stuff like
FOMO.
But I think the thing for me about the healing process is, not every organisation will have a horrible, horrific bullying culture.
Of course,
So the idea that that you would have a totally separate scheme with that level of support and intervention it isn't going to be relevant for a lot of organisations. But the principles, which is what Tracy's really talking about, of really listening, of taking a humanistic approach, all of those principles can be incorporated into the way that you do your grievances. You do, because they still have a place. You still need them, but you can adapt and modify the way in which you do them. And then for those organisations that do have really toxic and expose on their culture, they might actually want to consider something like a healing process scheme that adds that kind of restorative element to it. So
I think for me, you touch on right at the get-go when you talked about, it's not a blame game and how human resources is, in your view, what it, your view of what it should be. I think it just really resonates how much the leaders' soft skills have had to adapt over recent years. And some organisations aren't keeping up with that. There's a lot to be said in investment in soft skills for leaders.
Well, employees are more likely to speak up now, I find as well. I know when I started work, it was very hierarchical. You wouldn't dare challenge your boss or say anything, or even go to HR. You were seen as a bit of a grass or a snitch, I think. But organisations now are having to deal with people who are going to stand up and say, actually, I don't agree with that, and they should be able to, should train managers up to deal with that. But also encourage the other side of it where people don't feel comfortable in raising things as well. It's a balancing that now of managing people that will do it and encouraging people who should be saying things who don't.
Interestingly enough, CMP have just put out with the HPMA and UCLAN a piece of research looking at employee relations in the NHS, and exactly that issue has come out about the role of the line manager, particularly in the NHS, about people who get promoted because they're technical experts, not people experts.
So common.
But then the pressure within the health service, pressure to deliver, pressure on targets. Actually, so those managers are really compressed. They're squashed from the top, they're pushed from the bottom, and they trying to do a really amazing job without having the skill set necessarily to manage the people elements. I think that came out it was very interesting anyway. Quite timely with this bit of work as well.
We've done training with local NHS organisations and third-party organisations attached to them about training, because you're getting clinicians, like you said, or people who are very good at the job but have very limited management skills. And in any other organisation, they probably wouldn't get promoted in that way. You have to be a good manager. You have to show you are good at management. But I think it's sometimes systematic of a sector and industry of that.
Yes, it is. Yeah, definitely. But we just should be the conscience of the organisation, because if not, if HR doesn't fulfil that role, who does? And we have values that we put on the wall, and people very quickly become disillusioned if you don't live those values. Who is being that conscious to say, well, actually, if we look at it from that perspective, let's say respect is the top value, are we demonstrating respect in that way? So what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would you see if I came into your department and respect was fundamental?
But HR has its history in welfare. That's the first HR type people were welfare officers in Cadbury's and Rowntree's, and they looked after the staff. Mainly physically. They were physically well. They'd go around with baskets of fruit and make sure they were okay. The cynical side of it was get them back into work because it's better for the organisation. But early 1900s, they could have just basically got rid of people fairly quickly. So HR has that background into welfare. It moved into more HRM.
it's almost become part of the management team, I
Yes,
think, and they've you know, where that boundary's become blurred, to prove themselves. Because if there's any cost cutting, it's always the back office functions that are looked at first. So I think they felt they needed to justify themselves. And when Dave Ulrich said people should be HR should be business partners, again, I think that swung it. I don't think that's how he intended it, where they became that management side. But we equally, after sat on one board. And again, they were being scrutinised for the sickness absence after they'd had some particular issues. So they'd asked me to draft a new policy, which I drafted a very humanised policy to take forward, and that had been put in. And the following month, they're like, but the absence is not going down, and the regulator's coming in next week. What are we going to tell them? We need to start sacking people. And I'm like, And so the CEO's just sat watching, and he said, what do you think, Tracy? Do we need to start sacking people? So I just sat there. So I said, could do that. So I said, so who around here is going to tell me the contents of the policy? And there was just silence.
Yeah.
And I said, none of you know it, do you? And they went, no, we don't. So I said, so who do I sack first if that's the approach we take?
Yeah.
Exactly. You really got to question the leader and get the leaders to think. And they went, good point. What do we do, Tracy? Do you know what I mean? So it's equally challenging and challenging staff when it's not just about, because someone said, so are you all for the staff? And I said, if someone does something wrong, I'll equally ask them the difficult questions, about why they've gone down. But it's making, not making it, we can sometimes go over the top on the punishment and the outcome.
Yeah.
But it's being reasonable about that, if they're willing to learn, if it wasn't on purpose. All those factors have got to come into it, really, haven't they?
One final question from me. What do you think will happen when the rules change, probably next year now, of unfair dismissal from day one with a statutory 9-month notice period, and people can pursue litigation a bit more freely? We've got the backlog at the tribunals, which makes litigation somewhat unattractive because of the delay. Do you think this will serve a bigger purpose then? Be a bit,
I'd like to think
get some more people hearing, listening to the effects?
I'd like to think it would, but I think for me, the tribunal process is the wrong way to hear some of this stuff. So where it is about behaviours, I don't think that sits in the tribunal arena, because breach contract, dead clear. You can really legalistic get that. Point. Very legalistic point, contractual points, etc. Fundamentally, fraud. So you've done something, so you've been dismissed. Should you have been dismissed, etc. But where it's about behaviours and falling into bullying and all of that, I think the tribunal's out. The tribunal cases I see, it's out of its depth dealing with that, and therefore there's a very low success rate in tribunals for people who are taking those types of issues forward. So this process is much better. I do work. I get brought in to sit on disciplinaries, etc. For clients that we have, to do grievances, to do investigations. And they'll say, and one of the first things they'll tell me, we're all right with this one because they've been here less than 2 years.
It's
so
common
that's
HR
irrelevant.
language, isn't it?
That is absolutely irrelevant, because if we don't do it right, although you can be as confidential as you can, people talk outside. And if they see an employee treated poorly just because they've not been there 2 years, that again starts to impact on culture.
Absolutely.
So I think you'll still get those employees saying, so what can we do? Because now we haven't got that 2-year leeway, etc. But there's also inequity of arms in the tribunal system. So a lot of people don't have the funds to employ their own legal people because of the costs, the delays. You do get more litigants in person, and we are seeing more of that, which is really difficult. And, when I'm helping an employer, it is hard to see a litigant in person struggling in that arena. So it may do. Let's wait and see. But I think
this space.
I think I know. So I know from my work with ACAS that they are anticipating a huge rise in complaints and people coming forward. you think about somebody starting in an organisation, not, experiencing poor behaviours, poor culture, just not fitting, or being treated badly. You can imagine, that they would put in being discriminated against, victimised, all of that.
Likely to get inundated, but with the listing in some cases 2.5, 3 years ahead, it makes you wonder how the system's going to cope with it, which makes me lean towards this, you see, as a first stop.
And only 3% of whistleblowing claims. This is 2021 when we last had the full proper set of data. Only 3% of whistleblowing claims were successful.
Yeah.
3%.
Yeah, it's so low.
And it is traumatic going through a tribunal. We speak to claimants and respondents all the time. It's traumatic.
Yeah. And even if they win, that's the feedback we get, that it was so traumatic because I was attacked by their barrister, because that's the purpose, isn't it? To try and undermine and what have you. And what they have to go through, that stress of it. They said, I still feel further harmed, actually, now I've come out of that.
Well, you couldn't get a bit bigger blame game than you've won or you've lost, than a trip.
Yeah. I think it's an amazing thing that you kind of delivered. And I know through speaking to the participants how effective and fair it's been for them, and it's really helped them to heal, which is what the essence of it is.
Yeah, that was the whole purpose, and it was really fantastic to read that, and to see that. And we know you've had some comments direct to you, and CMP had comments direct to us, with people saying, just thank you, just it was difficult, it was challenging, but just to be listened to be believed, to have that allowed people. I think it's all about, a lot of it is about control, isn't it? You take back control of your own story, of your own narrative, whereas if you go into a formal process, somebody or a employment tribunal, somebody else is making the decision, somebody else is telling you how you should feel or shouldn't feel, or and this
you're
was,
right.
it was
Definitely.
This particular comment, the language used in that panel meeting, I found utterly affirming, vindicating and validating. Since then, I have experienced a huge change in my sense of perspective and outlook, as a restoration of my self-worth. I mean, you don't come out of a tribunal feeling like that, whether you win or lose, do you? Really?
Feel like you've been in a fight.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Good stuff.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you
on to
so much.
the podcast.
Really interesting.
Thank you.